Hi, I'm Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. I'm so glad you've joined us as we continue our study in the Gospel of Mark. We have been in chapter 6 for a couple of episodes now, and in our last live class, we took a look at a thread that is woven all through chapter 6. It is the theme of teaching truth and the implications of it. In chapter 6, verse 2, we see that Jesus goes to his hometown Nazareth and he teaches there. In fact, it says that the people were astonished by what they heard from him, and they ask, where did this man get these things? What is this wisdom given to him? And then it goes on to tell us that Jesus couldn't do a lot of miraculous works there because of their unbelief. Well, it's been said that familiarity breeds contempt, and that was true for those in Jesus' hometown. They knew him, they'd seen him grow up, and perhaps just didn't think that such a familiar one would ever be the one that Jesus certainly claimed to be. We see later on in chapter 6 and in verse 12 where Jesus had sent his disciples out to teach. He sent the 12 out in pairs, 2 by 2. And in verse 12 it says they went out and preached that men should repent. And before this, Jesus had told them that not everyone is going to want to listen to you. And so in verse 11 he says, well, shake the dust off the soles of your feet for a testimony against them. In a flashback to the death of John. Now, John had been taken into custody probably as long ago as a year and a half before the events that we're reading about in Mark chapter 6. But we're led to believe that perhaps his execution took place maybe shortly before this. And it was all because of what John taught or spoke about concerning Herod and his wife. In verse 18 of chapter 6, John had been saying to Herod, it's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. As we get into the things we're going to look at in today's study, we see where Jesus is still teaching. In verse 34 says that he saw a large crowd and he felt compassion for them because they were like a sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. And then later on he's astonished at the dullness of his own disciples who couldn't grasp a lot of that teaching. In verse 52 it says they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. And so we see this thread of the theme of teaching truth and the implications of it all throughout this narrative here. Well, we're gonna continue now in John chapter 6. The last thing we looked at was this flashback of John of his execution concerning the sheer vengefulness of Herodias, Herod's wife, as she seeks the death of John. Well, before that flashback, though, Mark had told us that Jesus had sent out his 12 in verses 7 through 13 to go preach. And now we see them return. In verse 30 of Mark chapter 6, it says that the apostles gathered together with Jesus. They had returned from their preaching trip, and they reported to him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, come away by yourselves to a secluded place and rest a while, for there were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. They went away in the boat to a secluded place by themselves. Now, there's no indication as to how long this mission lasted. It could have been anywhere from a few days to several weeks. But when they come back, Jesus suggests that they get away for a while. There are several reasons why Jesus may have suggested this. We see in verse 31 that there were a lot of people that were coming and going, and knowing about the sheer busyness of Jesus' day, of his days and the days of those who followed along with him, it would have made for some tiring times. Jesus says, let's go rest for a while. But don't forget, there's also the report of John's death. In Matthew chapter 14, in Matthew's account of of John the Baptist's death, it says in verse 13 that when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself. Now, this is exactly, I think, what's going on here in verse 30 and 31. Jesus says, let's go to a secluded place. Let's go away for a while and rest. Maybe the thought of John's gruesome and brutal death was weighing heavy on Jesus. After all, he was not only the forerunner to the Lord's ministry, but he was also a relative of Jesus. And so it's plain to see that this could have weighed on him in several ways. But there's also the growing concern of Herod. It told us here in Mark chapter 6 that Herod himself had heard about what was going on in verse 14. For Jesus' name had become well known, and Herod's superstition had caused him to think that perhaps it was John the Baptist risen from the dead. Maybe he thought that the ghost of John was going to come back and get him. But at any rate, they are at a place where they need to decompress and take some time. And verse 32 says they went away in the boat to a secluded place by themselves. Now Luke's gospel tells us that this secluded place is Bethsaida in Luke 9 verse 10, which was out of Herod Antipas's jurisdiction, and so perhaps that was the respite for a time that Jesus was looking for. But verse 33 says the people saw them going. Before we had seen this banquet, this huge feast that Herod had thrown for those men who were loyal to him. Now, by way of contrast, Jesus is going to host a different kind of banquet. One that's going to show his desire to feed people not only physically, especially not physically, but spiritually as well. Don't forget the theme of teaching that is woven through this chapter. And so let's continue reading in John chapter 6 as we observe the disciples observe a problem. We see in verse 33 that the people saw them going, and many recognized them and ran together on foot from all the cities and got there ahead of Jesus. And when Jesus went ashore, he saw the large crowd, and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it was already quite late, his disciples came to him and said, "This place is desolate, and it is already quite late. Send them away, so that they may go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread and give them something to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go look." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. And we'll stop there for just a moment. They're in this desolate place, as we had seen before. Verse 32 tells us that they had gone to a secluded place. Verse 35 says that the disciples acknowledge that the place is desolate. And obviously, there aren't going to be any 7-Elevens, there aren't any Kroger supermarkets, there's no Walmart to go to. There's nothing with which to feed the hungry crowd. And don't forget, probably the disciples as well as the Lord himself would have been hungry, since the crowds gave them no time to eat. In verse 31, it says they did not even have time to eat, Jesus and his disciples. So the disciples approach Jesus, and they declare the problem. Now, in John's gospel, it says that Jesus questions Philip in order to test him. And the test may have been whether or not they had learned anything from the many times that Jesus had provided in various ways before. We're going to see as we get to the end of this episode that that's certainly not the case. They had seen Jesus provide miraculous healing. They had seen him provide deliverance from demons. They had seen him provide calmness in the midst of a storm, and even restoration of life. Would they now believe that Jesus could provide bread in a deserted, desolate, secluded place. Their perspective of the problem, the way that they approach it, though, seems to indicate that they got a lot to learn. They have a lot to consider as far as the very identity of Jesus. One of the things that they suggest is sending the people away. Verse 36. Send them out to the surrounding countryside and villages, and so they can buy something for themselves. In other words, send them away, let them fend for themselves, which is, of course, is a huge contrary principle to Christianity. When there's a need, those who are Jesus' disciples and followers will try at least to find a way to address that need themselves if they can. All four Gospels tell us about this event, and every one of those Gospels tells us that the population of the men alone were 5,000. Now, some of their wives are with them, or if some of their wives and children were with them, the numbers could have easily swelled to 10,000 or more. This is a huge crowd. And, you know, to the apostles' defense, most other people would have thought the same thing. There's no way we can handle this. Let's just send them away and see what they can do for themselves. Another thing that they thought is that maybe throwing money at it might help, although they didn't have the money to throw at it. In verse 37, they asked Jesus, "Shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread and give them something to eat?" Now, maybe they did have the money. After all, there were those who were contributing to the support of Jesus and his disciples by this time. And there was a shared treasury that they had, a common money bag. So maybe they did have it. But this is no small amount of money, even if they did. It's 200 denarii, which was about 7 months' worth of wages. Now, that kind of bankroll doesn't come easily in a place as poor as northern Israel, where Jesus was. And even if they had that much money, the indication from the other Gospels is that it still wouldn't have been enough to buy everybody. And the thought of buying that much food and bringing it back must have seemed staggering to them. In fact, in the Gospels of Matthew and John, they thought that whatever resources they had were insufficient. But instead of these two things, Jesus simply says, "What do we have?" He says in verse 38, "How many loaves do you have? Go look." In other words, Jesus tells them to look to their own resources first, to see what it is that they have. And this is what they do when they come back, and they find 5 small loaves, probably no bigger than biscuits, and a couple of dried fish. Barely a boy's lunch. And this is it. This is all that they have among all the thousands that are hungry. Now, of course, that's barely enough to feed a hungry boy, and it's certainly much less enough to feed a crowd of hungry thousands. And yet Jesus had made a request for faith. Unfortunately, they responded in the weakness of the flesh. So Jesus himself solves the problem. In verse 39, it says, "He commanded them to sit down by groups on the green grass, and they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up toward heaven, he blessed the food and broke the loaves, and he kept giving them to the disciples to set before them. And he divided up the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 12 full baskets of the broken pieces, and also of the fish. And there were 5,000 men who ate the loaves." So Jesus has the people sit down in groups of 50 and 100. And you can just imagine this, the countryside dotted with groups of hungry people. And again, it must have been a staggering sight. It must have been, disheartening enough for the disciples to see this group all in one big crowd, but then to see them spread out and all the room that must have just seemed mind-blowing to them. What in the world are we going to do? We've got 5 little pieces of bread and we've got 2 fish. How is that going to feed anybody? Well, I want you to notice what Jesus does here. First of all, he looks to heaven. And that's symbolic in and of itself. Jesus always relied on his Father. Even though Jesus himself was fully God, he possessed full deity, still in his role as the Son of Man, as the Son of God on earth, as a human. He showed constant reliance and trust to his Father in all things. 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 23 tells us that Jesus in his suffering entrusted himself to God, who was able to judge faithfully. Well, it wasn't only in his suffering that Jesus entrusted himself to heaven's care. We see him doing this very thing here. He looks toward heaven. And maybe this was Jesus' common posture of praying. He looks up towards heaven. But I want you to notice also that as he prays, he blesses, he gives thanks. He gives thanks for this food that they have, this meager bit. And that's an important thing to us. By giving thanks to God, Jesus reminded the people that it was God himself who was supplying their need, even though these are going to come from the hands of Jesus. Jesus always pointed people to the providence and the care of his Father. And that's what he does now. And what happens with 5 little bits of bread and 2 small fish? Well, we're told in verse 42 that they all ate and were satisfied. There was more than enough. In fact, they pick up 12 full baskets of the broken pieces of bread as well as the fish. So there's not just enough, there's abundantly enough. There's more than enough. Everyone's need was met with plenty left over. 12 baskets full, which I think is maybe symbolic itself. 1 basket for every doubting disciple was gathered up after this meal. Jesus gave his disciples what seemed to be an impossible command to fill. And maybe that's something for us to think about. Maybe we need to recognize that without heaven, without the Lord, without the help of God, anything is impossible for us. We can't be good. We can't be acceptable to him unless it weren't for him. We ourselves can't be full and satisfied. We won't see the significance and meaning that this life has for us apart from the Lord and his will for us. There's a lot of symbolism that's going on in this episode of feeding this crowd of thousands of hungry people. And I love the fact that Jesus always pointed to the fact that his Father is the one who provides. Well, let's move along and let's take a look at Jesus the water walker as we continue in Mark chapter 6. Now, it's evident that the people must have been highly impressed by Jesus. In verse 45, it says that Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side to Bethsaida, while he himself was sending the crowd away. And after bidding them farewell, he left for the mountain to pray. And when it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, at about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and he intended to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed that it was a ghost, and they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke with them and said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." We'll stop there for now. Now, as Jesus sends them away, John's gospel tells us that was done for a reason. After the feeding of the 5,000, people were starting to think that perhaps Jesus is the prophet that Moses had spoken about. And so maybe they're thinking he's more than just a miracle worker. Maybe he's the one. Maybe he's the Messiah that we've been looking for all this time. And John's gospel tells us that fueled by the prospects of having such a leader, they intended to take him by force and make him king. So that gives some context to us about verse 45, where Jesus immediately made his disciples go into the boat and leave. Jesus thwarts their plans that are really contrary to the methodical, predetermined plan of God. He does it by three decisive actions. One, by sending his disciples away, by dismissing the crowd, and then he disappears himself into the mountains. Maybe Jesus will finally get the rest that he had originally come for. Well, not so much. We see that there's a dangerous situation. In verses 47 and 48, they're straining at the oars because the wind is against them. And Jesus is watching all of this happen. He sees it going on in verse 48. Seeing them straining, he came to them. Now, for the disciples, maybe it would have been easier for them just to turn back. After a way, the wind would have helped them go back. They were pushing against the wind. It would have been easier to turn around and let the wind push them back to where they had come. But to their credit, the disciples are determined to press on. Jesus said, go to the other side, to Bethsaida, and that's what they do. They go, or at least they begin their journey. They're resolved to do it. And then Jesus comes to them, the dependable Savior as ever. In verse 49, when they saw him, though, walking on the sea, they supposed that he was a ghost, and they cried out. Now, I want you to realize what's going on here. This is, it tells us in verse 48, about the fourth watch of the night, somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m. So it was dark. The apostles had been in the boat all night, straining against a contrary wind, and Jesus comes walking to them on the water. No wonder they're a little beside themselves. No wonder they thought maybe it was an apparition or something else that they were seeing. The whole thing just unnerves them, and they cry out in verse 49. It's a ghost. Well, this surreal scene to them is another indication of how Jesus comes to help when his followers are in trouble. Of course, they're not going to get this just yet. It'll take a while, but it's a reminder to us disciples today that Jesus will come to help us when we're in trouble. I want you to notice what he says to them. In verse 50, he says, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Now, that's a normal response of a person identifying himself to maybe comfort someone else, but coming from the lips of Jesus, it takes on a whole new significance. When he says, "It is I," it's from a Greek phrase that is sometimes often translated, "I am." In fact, it is literally, "I am." Take courage. I am, Jesus says. And this is, of course, the phrase that was used by God to identify himself to Moses in that burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. It's also the phrase that Jesus uses to assert his deity in John 8, verse 58, where he says, "Before Abraham was, I am." And it's the phrase that he uses to identify himself later on when the Roman soldiers come to arrest him in the Garden of Gethsemane. He says, "You're looking for Jesus. I am he." This is so important. the one speaking to these frightened men in the middle of a windy lake was not just an encouraging friend. He was the God who created that sea and everything that was in it. He was the God who was walking on the very sea that he had created. You would think that perhaps this would have some kind of positive effect on the disciples, but we see them as dull as ever. In verse 51, it says, he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished. But notice their dullness in verse 52. They had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. Matthew's account of this includes Peter's failed attempt to walk on water and their astonishment and worship. Back in Matthew 14, they exclaim, "You are certainly God's Son," as if maybe they doubted it before. But although in Matthew's gospel they rightly confessed Jesus and properly worshiped him, still there's this indication of lingering hard-heartedness. Mark 6:51 and 52 reveals the astonishment that resulted from the fact that they learned little from the miraculous feeding of the multitude the day before. The implication is that if they had just considered what Jesus had already done, if they had just considered the miracle of the loaves and fishes, because that's what they hadn't gained any insight from, if they had just considered the miracle of the loaves and fishes, they would have realized that the same power that multiplied that food is the power that always resided in Jesus. It was a power that enabled him to walk on the sea and to bring calmness to these men of little faith. They should have realized that if he was able to have the power to multiply the loaves and fishes, then certainly even the wind and the waves would obey him, as Matthew says in Matthew 9, verse 27. There are some important things going on here. One of them is to consider for a moment that if we fail to see Jesus for who he is, really, if we fail in our perspective of his identity, then we're never going to come to a full appreciation of all that he can do for us. Jesus is a water walker because Jesus created the very water that he walked on. Jesus is a problem solver, as he was back in the incident of the loaves and the fishes, because he is the one who provides the answer to every situation, every obstacle, every problem in our lives. For everything, it's Jesus and his word, his teaching, that's the answer. Well, thanks for being with us as we've looked through this section, these two sections here in Mark chapter 6. And I hope we'll see you next time. God bless you.